The tiny apartment smelled of cooking oil and damp concrete. Rain pattered against the single window, creating small puddles on the floor beneath it. 6 people lived in this small space on the outskirts of São Paulo, but only 2 were home now, a 12-year-old boy and an old upright piano with chipped keys and yellowed ivory. Pedro's fingers moved across the keys with a confidence that didn't match his surroundings. The piano itself seemed out of place, too large for the cramped room, pushed against the wall where it took up space that could have held another bed. His family slept in shifts because of it, but nobody ever suggested getting rid of the piano. It was the one beautiful thing they owned. The melody Pedro played wasn't from any book. He couldn't afford sheet music and wouldn't have been able to read it anyway. He played by ear, recreating songs he heard on the radio or from passing cars, or sometimes making up his own tunes. Today, he was practicing something he'd heard from a street performer downtown, a complex jazz piece that had stuck in his head for days. When the door creaked open, Pedro didn't stop playing. His mother stepped inside, plastic bags hanging from both arms, her uniform from the cleaning service still on. She set the bags down quietly, not wanting to interrupt. Her face, lined with exhaustion just moments before, softened as she listened. "That's new," she said when he finished, unpacking a small bag of beans. "Where did you learn that one?" "Man playing near the market," Pedro answered, running his finger over a cracked key. He had a real piano, Mama, not like this one. All the keys worked. His mother's hands paused over the groceries. "This piano has character," she said firmly. "Each crack tells a story." The piano had been salvaged 3 years ago when the local church was renovating. It was going to be thrown away. Too damaged to repair, they'd said. Pedro's mother had begged the church to let her take it. It had taken 6 men to carry it up to their 5th-floor apartment, and she had paid them with home-cooked meals for a week. "Your father will be home late again," she said, changing the subject. "The factory has extra shifts." Pedro nodded, knowing what that meant. His father had been coughing more lately, the factory dust settling in his lungs like it did with all the workers eventually. The extra money would help with medicine, but the longer hours made the coughing worse. It was a cycle they couldn't escape. The apartment filled as evening approached. Pedro's older sister came home from her job at the laundry. His 2 younger brothers returned from school, full of energy despite their worn uniforms and empty stomachs. His grandmother, who shared a bed with Pedro, arrived last, her arthritis making each step up the 5 flights of stairs a small journey. Dinner was beans, rice, and a small portion of chicken divided 6 ways. They ate sitting on beds in the 2 rickety chairs, balancing plates on their laps. Despite their hunger, everyone ate slowly, making the food last. Pedro's father's empty chair stood as a reminder of his absence. "Play something for us, Pedro," his grandmother said when they finished. It was their nightly ritual when electricity was too expensive to use for television. Pedro returned to the piano. He chose something gentle, a tune his grandmother had taught him. She hummed along, her voice thin but perfectly in tune. She was the one who had first noticed Pedro's talent. When he was just 4 years old, picking out melodies on a toy xylophone, she had been the one to insist he needed a real instrument someday. She could have been a great musician. Pedro's mother often told him about his grandmother. She studied at a music school for a year before she had to quit to support her family. The music filled their small space, making it seem larger somehow. Even Pedro's little brothers, usually restless, sat quietly listening. This was the magic of the piano. For a little while, it transported them somewhere else, somewhere the ceiling didn't leak and the walls weren't thin enough to hear the neighbors fighting. When Pedro finished, his grandmother clapped her gnarled hands. "My teacher used to say that music isn't in the instrument but in the heart of the player," she said. "You have music in your heart, boy." Pedro smiled but said nothing. He had heard all his grandmother's stories about her brief time at the music academy. Sometimes he dreamed about going to a place like that, with real teachers and perfect pianos. But such dreams were pointless. Schools like that weren't for people from his neighborhood. Later that night, after his siblings and grandmother were asleep, Pedro sat at the window watching rain fall on the city. His mother approached quietly and sat beside him. "I spoke with Mrs. Luce today," she said, while cleaning her house. "She has a son who plays in an orchestra." Pedro looked up, suddenly interested. Mrs. Luce was one of the wealthy women whose homes his mother cleaned. "I told her about you," his mother continued. "She said maybe sometime her son could hear you play. He knows people who might help, maybe a scholarship." Hope flickered briefly in Pedro's chest before reality extinguished it. "We can't afford lessons, Mama, and I need to start working soon to help Papa." His mother's face hardened with determination. "Your father and I didn't work all these years for you to give up your gift. You will finish school, and you will play your piano." A coughing fit from the other side of the room interrupted them. Pedro's father had returned, his work clothes still dusty, his face gray with exhaustion. Pedro's mother rushed to help him to bed, reaching for the medicine they kept for his bad nights. Pedro waited until his parents were settled before approaching his father. Despite his exhaustion, his father reached out to ruffle Pedro's hair. "Did you practice today?" he whispered, his voice raspy. "Yes, Papa. 2 hours." His father nodded approvingly. "Good. Never stop playing." That night, Pedro lay awake long after everyone else was sleeping. His grandmother's soft snores blended with his father's labored breathing and the distant sounds of the city. The weight of his family's struggles pressed down on him, but alongside it was another feeling: responsibility for the gift they had sacrificed to nurture. The next morning, Pedro woke before dawn. He had an idea. While his family slept, he scribbled a note saying he would be back for dinner. Then he took the old hat his father no longer used and headed downtown. The Central Plaza was already busy with early workers rushing to their jobs. Pedro found the public piano tucked under a small pavilion. It wasn't as nice as the ones in shop windows, but it was better than his at home. At least all the keys worked. These pianos had been placed throughout the city as part of a public arts program, but few people used them except for the occasional tourist plinking out simple tunes. Pedro sat down nervously, placing his father's hat on top of the piano. He took a deep breath and began to play. He started with something simple, a popular song everyone would recognize. A few people slowed their walk, glancing his way. When that song ended, he moved into something more complex, one of his grandmother's old pieces that she had taught him note by note. A woman in a business suit stopped and dropped a few coins in the hat before hurrying away. Encouraged, Pedro continued playing. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered. They didn't stay long, just a minute or two before continuing their day, but almost everyone left something in the hat. By lunchtime, street vendors had set up near him, benefiting from the small crowds his music attracted. One of them, an older man selling coffee, brought Pedro a sandwich and a small cup. "You're good for business, kid," he said with a wink. "Come back tomorrow." Pedro played until his fingers ached. When the afternoon crowd thinned, he counted his earnings. It wasn't much. Not enough to make a real difference for his family, but it was something. More importantly, people had listened. They had found value in his playing. On the bus ride home, clutching his small earnings, Pedro made a decision. He would come back every day he could. He would play until someone who mattered heard him. He would find a way to use his music to help his family. What Pedro didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that in 3 weeks' time, someone would indeed hear him. Someone who would recognize not just his talent, but something much more specific in the melodies his grandmother had taught him, and everything would change. But for now, he was just a boy returning home on a crowded bus, his calloused fingers tapping out rhythms on his knees, his mind already composing tomorrow's performances, and his heart a little lighter with the first taste of possibility. 3 weeks passed, and the Central Plaza became Pedro's second home. Every morning he arrived as the city woke up, claimed his spot at the public piano, and played until sunset. His routine had expanded. Morning songs were light and cheerful for hurried commuters. Midday performances featured popular tunes that made tourists stop and smile, and evening melodies turned thoughtful as workers headed home, their shoulders heavy with the day's burdens. The coffee vendor, whom Pedro now knew as Luis, kept an eye on him. "You're getting better," Luis mentioned one afternoon, handing Pedro a sandwich. "And your hat's getting fuller." It was true. Some days Pedro brought home enough to buy medicine for his father without dipping into their rent money. His mother had been skeptical at first, worried about him spending days alone in the city center. But when she saw how his earnings helped stretch their budget, her objections softened. "Just be careful," she warned each morning as he left. "Stay where people can see you." On this particular Tuesday, dark clouds hung over the city. Few people lingered in the plaza, hurrying instead to finish their business before the rain came. Pedro considered going home early but decided to wait a little longer. His father's cough had worsened, and they needed money for a doctor's visit. He switched from the usual upbeat tunes to something more fitting for the gloomy weather, one of his grandmother's melodies. It was an old piece she said her teacher had composed, something that had never been written down. The haunting tune seemed to float across the nearly empty plaza, mingling with the distant thunder. Pedro closed his eyes as he played, letting his fingers remember the path his grandmother had shown him. The melody had strange turns and unexpected harmonies that didn't follow the patterns of songs on the radio. It was the hardest piece she had taught him, and he felt proud whenever he played it without mistakes. He was so absorbed in the music that he didn't notice the rain starting, nor the tall man who stopped under the pavilion's shelter, listening with an expression of disbelief. When Pedro finished the piece, a voice behind him asked, "Where did you learn that song?" Pedro turned to find a stranger watching him. The man was well dressed in a way that made Pedro instantly conscious of his own worn clothes. He spoke Portuguese with an accent Pedro couldn't place. "My grandmother taught me," Pedro answered cautiously, remembering his mother's warnings about talking to strangers. "Your grandmother?" the man repeated, still looking stunned.
"May I ask her name?"
"Helena Oliveira," Pedro said, closing the piano lid as the rain fell harder. Few people would stop for music now, and his earnings for the day would have to be enough. The stranger's eyes widened. "Helena Oliveira from Minas Gerais, who studied at the National Conservatory in 1968. Pedro stared at the man, confused by how he could know such details. "Yes, that's her. She only studied for a year, though." "My name is Eduardo," the man said, extending his hand. "I think I need to speak with your grandmother." Pedro hesitated. His family had strict rules about strangers, especially wealthy-looking ones who asked questions. Yet something in Eduardo's face, a kind of desperate hope, made Pedro consider his request. "I can give her a message," Pedro offered, picking up his father's hat with the day's earnings. Eduardo shook his head. "What I have to say must be in person. Please, it's important." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "I'm a professor at the Vienna Conservatory. I'm only in São Paulo for 3 more days." Pedro studied the card. It was fancy paper with gold lettering that named Eduardo as a professor of piano and composition. Still uncertain, Pedro tucked it into his pocket. "I'll ask her," he said. "But I can't promise she'll want to meet." Eduardo nodded. "Fair enough. I'll be here tomorrow at the same time. If she won't come, perhaps you could at least tell me more about that piece you were playing." The rain had become a downpour. Pedro nodded a quick goodbye and darted into the storm, running for the bus stop. As he rode home, water dripping from his clothes onto the bus floor, he wondered about the strange encounter. His grandmother rarely spoke about her time at the music school, and never mentioned anyone from abroad. That evening, after dinner, Pedro found his grandmother alone in the kitchen. She was washing dishes slowly, her arthritic hands moving carefully through the soapy water. "Someone asked about you today," Pedro said, helping her dry a plate. "A man named Eduardo. He knew you studied at the conservatory." His grandmother's hands stilled in the water. "Eduardo?" she repeated. "I don't recall any Eduardo. He's from Vienna," Pedro continued. "He heard me playing your song, the one you said your teacher composed." He seemed very surprised. The plate his grandmother was holding slipped from her fingers, clattering back into the sink. Water splashed onto her dress, but she didn't seem to notice. "What did you tell him?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp. "Just your name," Pedro said, confused by her reaction. "He wants to meet you. He gave me his card." His grandmother dried her hands and took the card, studying it with narrowed eyes. For a long moment she said nothing, just stared at the embossed lettering as if it might change before her eyes. "Bring him here tomorrow," she finally said. "After you finish playing," Pedro blinked in surprise. "Here?" "But the apartment is our home," she interrupted firmly. "And if he truly wants to speak with me, he won't mind where I live." The next day, Pedro found Eduardo waiting by the piano, despite the continuing rain. When Pedro explained his grandmother's invitation, Eduardo nodded eagerly. "Of course, I'll come. The location doesn't matter." Pedro played for a few hours, earning less than usual because of the weather. Eduardo sat nearby the entire time, occasionally closing his eyes when Pedro played his grandmother's melodies. As they rode the bus to Pedro's neighborhood, Eduardo explained that he was in Brazil for a music conference. I almost didn't come to the plaza that day, he said. I was supposed to attend a lecture, but something drew me to walk instead. Pedro's neighborhood looked especially gray and run down after the rain. Puddles filled the uneven streets and laundry hung damply from windows, unable to dry in the humid air. Eduardo didn't comment on their surroundings, but Pedro noticed how out of place the professor's polished shoes looked on the muddy paths. At the apartment, Pedro's grandmother was waiting. She had put on her best dress, faded blue with carefully mended seams, and had swept the small apartment as best she could. Pedro's mother hovered nearby, looking both curious and concerned about their unusual visitor. When Eduardo entered, he stopped in the doorway, staring at Pedro's grandmother with an expression of recognition. "You look just like him," he said softly. "Like who?" Pedro's mother asked. "Antonio Barreto," Eduardo answered, his voice filled with emotion. "Her teacher. My mentor." Pedro's grandmother gestured for Eduardo to sit on one of their two chairs. "You knew Antonio?" she asked. "He took me in when I was not much older than your grandson," Eduardo explained. "I was his student for 10 years until his death in 1995. "I didn't know he had died," Pedro's grandmother said quietly. "After I left the conservatory, I lost touch with everyone there." "He spoke of you," Eduardo said. "He said you were one of his most gifted students. He regretted that you had to leave." Pedro watched his grandmother's face soften with memories. "He was a kind man. When I could no longer pay the tuition, he offered to teach me for free. But my family needed me to work." "The song my grandson played for you," she continued, "Antonio composed it the week before I left. He said it was a farewell gift, something that would never be published or performed for others. Something just for me." Eduardo leaned forward. "He composed many pieces that were never published. After his death, I tried to catalog his work, but many were lost. When I heard your grandson playing that melody, a piece I thought no one else knew, I couldn't believe it." Pedro's mother brought cups of coffee, serving Eduardo first. The professor thanked her, but kept his attention on Pedro's grandmother. "Helena," Eduardo said earnestly, "Antonio's music deserves to be heard. And your grandson plays with remarkable talent for someone with no formal training." He turned to Pedro. "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 6, Pedro answered. "But we've only had the piano for 3 years. And before that?" "He practiced on a cardboard keyboard I drew for him," his grandmother said proudly. "He would press the paper keys and hear the music in his head." Eduardo looked around the small apartment, his eyes lingering on the battered upright piano against the wall. Without comment, he walked over and opened the lid, checking the strings and hammers inside. "It needs proper tuning," he said, "but the frame is solid." He played a few notes, wincing slightly at the off-key sound. "Your grandson has learned to compensate for the tuning issues. That's quite remarkable." He closed the piano and turned to face them all. "I have a proposal," he said. "The conservatory in Vienna has a youth program, full scholarships for exceptional talents. I believe Pedro would qualify." The room fell silent. Pedro felt his heart race with a sudden dizzying hope. "Vienna is very far," his mother finally said, her voice uncertain. "It is," Eduardo agreed, "but this could change his life. And," he added, looking at Pedro's grandmother, "we could work together to preserve Antonio's music through Pedro. The pieces you remember, that were never written down. They could live on." In the silence that followed, Pedro's father's coughing echoed from the bedroom where he was resting after his shift. The sound, harsh and painful, seemed to make the decision for them all. "We need to think about it," Pedro's mother said, her eyes moving to the bedroom door. Eduardo nodded. "Of course. I understand this is sudden." He wrote something on the back of another business card. "This is where I'm staying in São Paulo. I leave on Friday." As Eduardo prepared to depart, he paused at the door. "Whether you decide to accept my offer or not," he said to Pedro, "don't stop playing. You have a rare gift." After he left, the family sat in stunned silence. Pedro stared at the business card, at the address of an expensive hotel he had passed many times but never entered. "Could this be real?" his mother finally asked. Pedro's grandmother reached for her hand. "Antonio Barreto was the finest composer I ever knew," she said. "If this man truly studied with him, then yes, I believe it could be." The next 2 days passed in a blur of family discussions. Pedro's mother worried about sending her son so far away. His father, between coughing fits, insisted they couldn't stand in the way of such an opportunity. His grandmother remained quiet, lost in memories of her own abandoned musical dreams. Pedro himself felt torn. The thought of studying music properly on real pianos with actual teachers made his heart race with excitement. But leaving his family behind, especially with his father's health worsening, filled him with guilt. "I should stay and work," he told his mother as they washed dishes together. "I can earn money playing in the plaza." His mother shook her head firmly. "The coins you collect won't pay for the medicines your father needs." "Not really." She scrubbed a pot with more force than necessary. "We've been pretending it's enough because we had no other options." She looked at Pedro, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But now there's another path. If this professor is genuine, if this scholarship is real, what if it's not?" Pedro asked, voicing the fear they all shared. "What if we go to the hotel and he's not even there?" His mother dried her hands. "Then we'll know. But we have to try." On Thursday morning, Pedro didn't go to the plaza. Instead, the whole family dressed in their best clothes, the ones saved for church and special occasions. His father insisted on coming despite his weakness, saying this was too important to miss. The hotel where Eduardo was staying stood like a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the wealthier part of the city. As they approached the entrance, a doorman in a crisp uniform gave them a suspicious look. Pedro's father straightened his shoulders and spoke clearly despite his raspy voice. "We have an appointment with Professor Eduardo Martins." The doorman looked skeptical but made a phone call. To everyone's surprise, Eduardo himself appeared in the lobby minutes later, greeting them warmly. "I'm so glad you came," he said, leading them to a quiet corner with comfortable chairs. "I was worried I might leave Brazil without seeing you again." Pedro's mother got straight to the point. "This scholarship you mentioned, what exactly does it involve?" Eduardo explained that the Vienna Conservatory had a program for exceptional young musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds. "It covers tuition, housing, meals, and even a small stipend," he said. "Students live in dormitories supervised by faculty families." "And you believe my son qualifies?" Pedro's father asked, trying to suppress a cough. "Without question," Eduardo answered. "His natural talent is remarkable. With proper training, he could become extraordinary." "If he went," Pedro's grandmother spoke up, "what would happen to Antonio's music?" "The pieces I remember?" Eduardo's face lit up. "That's the other part of my proposal. The conservatory has been trying to collect and preserve Antonio Barreto's work for years. Many of his compositions were never published or formally recorded. If you would be willing to share what you remember, it would be an invaluable contribution to musical history." "You want me to come to Vienna too?" Pedro's grandmother asked, surprised. "Eventually, perhaps for a visit," Eduardo said. "But we could start by recording you here before I leave. I have equipment in my room." Pedro's father leaned forward. "This all sounds wonderful, but forgive my skepticism. Why would you do this for strangers?" Eduardo nodded, understanding the question. "Partly for Antonio's music, which deserves to be preserved. Partly for the conservatory, which benefits from discovering exceptional talents." He looked at Pedro. "But mostly because 25 years ago, I was a boy not much different from your son." He told them how Antonio Barreto had found him playing a broken-down piano in a community center in Santiago, Chile. How the composer had arranged for him to study in Vienna, changing the course of his life. "I promised Antonio I would do the same if I ever found someone with true gift." Eduardo finished quietly. Pedro's mother wiped a tear from her cheek. "When would he need to leave?" "The fall term begins in 2 months," Eduardo said. "But ideally, Pedro would come sooner for language classes and preliminary training." 2 months, Pedro's father repeated, looking at his son. "That's very soon." As the adults continued discussing details, Pedro wandered to the grand piano that sat in the corner of the hotel lobby. It was the most beautiful instrument he had ever seen, its surface gleaming in the sunlight from the tall windows. Eduardo noticed his interest. "Would you like to play it?" Pedro nodded hesitantly. The doorman frowned, but Eduardo spoke to him quietly, and the man stepped back with a reluctant nod. Pedro sat on the bench, immediately noticing how smoothly it adjusted, unlike the wobbly stool at home. He placed his fingers on the keys, marveling at how perfectly they responded to his touch. Without thinking too much about it, he began to play his grandmother's melody, the one that had caught Eduardo's attention in the plaza. On this magnificent piano, the song sounded completely different. Richer, more complex, with harmonies he'd never fully heard on his damaged instrument at home. Hotel guests stopped to listen, their conversations falling silent. Pedro lost himself in the music, forgetting his surroundings, his family's struggles, the life-changing decision hanging over them. For those few minutes, there was only the music, flowing through his fingers as naturally as breathing. When he finished, the lobby remained quiet for a moment before erupting in applause. Pedro blushed, unused to such attention. He looked back at his family and saw his grandmother crying softly, his mother holding her hand. Eduardo approached with a look of certainty. "That settles it," he said. "You must come to Vienna." Later that afternoon, they gathered in Eduardo's hotel room. He had transformed it into a makeshift recording studio, with equipment Pedro had never seen before. "Just play the pieces as you remember them," Eduardo instructed Pedro's grandmother. "Don't worry about mistakes. We can edit later." At first she was nervous, her voice shaky as she hummed the melodies Antonio had taught her decades ago. But gradually, as Pedro accompanied her on a keyboard Eduardo had set up, she relaxed. The music seemed to transport her back to her youth, and her voice grew stronger, more confident. They recorded for hours, Eduardo taking detailed notes about each piece, when Antonio had composed it, what had inspired it, how it was meant to be performed. Pedro watched in fascination as his grandmother's seemingly random collection of songs was revealed to be an important part of musical history. "These are incredible," Eduardo said when they finished. Some of these pieces were thought to be completely lost. By evening, the decision had been made. Pedro would go to Vienna. His mother would accompany him for the first month to help him settle in, while his grandmother would stay behind with his father and siblings. "The stipend will allow Pedro to send money home," Eduardo explained, "and the conservatory has a health program that might be able to help with your husband's condition." As they prepared to leave the hotel, Eduardo handed Pedro a folder. "Your acceptance letter, visa application forms, and travel information," he said. "I've taken the liberty of starting the paperwork. We'll need to move quickly." Outside the hotel, as they waited for the bus, Pedro's family was uncharacteristically quiet. The enormity of what was happening, of how their lives were about to change, seemed to leave them all speechless. "Are you scared?" Pedro's youngest brother finally asked him. Pedro nodded honestly. "Yes, but also excited." His father put an arm around his shoulders. "Fear and excitement often feel the same in our bodies," he said. "The difference is in how we think about them." That night, Pedro couldn't sleep. He sat at their old piano, playing softly in the darkness. The familiar broken keys and off-tuned strings that had once been his whole world now felt different. Not lesser, but like a chapter ending. His grandmother joined him, sitting on the edge of the bed nearby. "Do you think I'm betraying the family by going?" Pedro whispered. She shook her head firmly. "You're not betraying us by accepting this chance. You would only betray us, and yourself, if you refused it." She took his hand, her fingers gnarled with arthritis but still strong. "When I gave up music to support my family, I thought I was doing the right thing, and perhaps it was the only choice I had then. But I've always wondered what might have been." She looked at the piano, at the cracked keys that Pedro had learned to work around. "Now I don't have to wonder about you. I'll know." The following week was a whirlwind of preparations. Eduardo helped expedite the visa process, calling in favors from the Austrian consulate. Pedro's mother got her first passport. The neighborhood held a small fundraiser to help with expenses not covered by the scholarship, and through it all, Pedro continued to play in the plaza, at home, even once at the church where their old piano had come from. Each performance felt like both a goodbye and a beginning. On his last day at the plaza, Luis, the coffee vendor, presented him with a small wooden box. "For your piano picks," he said with a wink. Pedro laughed. "Pianists don't use picks," Luis shrugged, smiling. "Then use it for whatever musicians in Vienna need to carry. And remember where you started." As Pedro played his final song in the plaza where Eduardo had first discovered him, he realized that his life had been divided into two parts. Before that rainy afternoon when a stranger recognized his grandmother's melody, and everything that came after. The Vienna airport buzzed with languages Pedro couldn't identify. People rushed past pulling sleek suitcases while announcements echoed overhead in German, English, and several other tongues. Pedro clutched his single worn bag closer, feeling small and out of place. Stay close, his mother murmured, her own eyes wide as she took in their surroundings. Neither of them had ever flown before today. The journey from São Paulo had been both terrifying and thrilling. Watching their city shrink beneath them, seeing the curve of the earth for the first time, crossing an ocean they had only read about in books. Eduardo had arranged everything, from their passports and visas to the tickets themselves. He had flown back to Vienna 2 weeks earlier to prepare for Pedro's arrival, but had promised to meet them at the airport. "Do you see him?" Pedro's mother asked, scanning the crowd. Before Pedro could answer, Eduardo appeared, waving enthusiastically. The familiar face amid so much strangeness was like finding solid ground after being adrift at sea. "Welcome to Vienna." Eduardo embraced them both. "How was your flight?" "Long," Pedro admitted. "But the food was good." Eduardo laughed. "Well, the food will be even better here, I promise." "Are you hungry now?" They were, but both were too overwhelmed to say so. Eduardo seemed to understand without being told. He guided them through the airport to a waiting taxi, speaking to the driver in German. As they drove into the city, Pedro pressed his face against the window. Vienna looked nothing like São Paulo. The buildings were older, many ornate with columns and statues. The streets were cleaner, the cars smaller. Even the light seemed different, softer somehow, filtering through trees that lined many of the avenues. "It's beautiful," his mother whispered. "It is," Eduardo agreed. "And it will be Pedro's home for the next several years. Home." The word struck Pedro oddly. Home was their small apartment with the leaky ceiling. Home was the sound of his brothers arguing over who got the last piece of bread. Home was his grandmother humming as she mended clothes by the window. This beautiful, strange city couldn't possibly be home. Yet Eduardo spoke as if it were already decided, as if the scholarship and the move were permanent fixtures in Pedro's life, rather than a dream that might still dissolve upon waking. Their first stop wasn't a hotel, as Pedro had expected, but a stately building with conservatorium carved above its entrance. "The director wanted to meet you right away," Eduardo explained, seeing their surprise. "Just a quick introduction, then we'll get you settled in your apartment." Pedro's heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't prepared for this, not now, exhausted from travel, wearing clothes that suddenly seemed shabbier than ever. "Maybe tomorrow would be better," his mother suggested. Noticing his panic, Eduardo shook his head gently. "Director Hoffman rarely makes time for new students. This is a special exception because of Antonio's music." Inside, the conservatory was even more intimidating. The entrance hall rose 3 stories high, with a massive chandelier and portraits of severe-looking men in old-fashioned clothes. The floor was marble, and their footsteps echoed as they followed Eduardo down a corridor lined with practice rooms. Through each door, Pedro caught snippets of music, a violin here, a cello there, a chorus of voices behind another. They stopped at a heavy wooden door with a brass nameplate. Eduardo knocked, and a voice called for them to enter. Director Hoffman was a tall woman with silver hair cut precisely at her jawline. She did not smile as they entered, but studied Pedro with piercing blue eyes. "So this is our new discovery," she said in accented but perfect Portuguese. "The boy who knows Antonio Barreto's lost compositions." Pedro looked at Eduardo in surprise. The professor hadn't mentioned that the director spoke his language. "I studied in Brazil for a year," she explained, noticing his reaction. "Sit, please." They sat in stiff chairs across from her desk. The office was lined with books and framed certificates. A small piano stood in the corner. "Professor Martins tells me you have never had formal training," the director continued, addressing Pedro directly. "Is this true?" Pedro nodded. "My grandmother taught me what she remembered from her year at the conservatory. The rest I figured out on my own." The director made a note on a pad of paper. "And you can play Barreto's unpublished works from memory." "Some of them," Pedro answered honestly. "My grandmother taught me 5 or 6 pieces completely. Parts of others." Director Hoffman turned to Eduardo. "And you verified these are genuine Barreto compositions?" "Without question," Eduardo said firmly. "I recognize the harmonic structures immediately. They match his later period, around 1968-1970, when he was experimenting with Brazilian folk influences." The director nodded, then turned back to Pedro. "I would like to hear you play." Pedro glanced at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod despite the worry in her eyes. He stood and moved to the piano in the corner. This instrument was smaller than the grand piano at the hotel in São Paulo, but still far superior to his piano at home. He placed his fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play his grandmother's farewell song, the piece that had first caught Eduardo's attention. As the music filled the office, Pedro forgot about his exhaustion, the intimidating director, and even his own doubts. The melody carried him back to evenings in their tiny apartment, his grandmother guiding his hands, teaching him to feel the music rather than just play the notes. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Director Hoffman's face remained impassive, but her voice had softened slightly when she spoke. "You have talent, certainly. Raw, undisciplined, but genuine." She looked at Eduardo. "He will need intensive training to catch up to our standards." "I'm aware," Eduardo said. "I'm prepared to work with him personally in addition to his regular classes." The director made another note, then stood abruptly. "Very well. We will proceed as discussed." She extended her hand to Pedro's mother. "Welcome to Vienna, Mrs. Oliveira. The conservatory will cover your housing for 1 month as agreed. After that, Pedro will move to the student dormitory." Outside the conservatory, Pedro finally relaxed enough to ask the question that had been burning in his mind. "Did I pass? Am I accepted?" Eduardo smiled. "You were accepted before you arrived, Pedro. Director Hoffman just needed to see for herself what I had described." He clapped Pedro on the shoulder. "You impressed her, though she'd never show it. She doesn't believe in inflating young egos." Their temporary apartment was small but clean, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchenette, and a bathroom with hot running water, a luxury Pedro's family didn't have at home. Best of all, there was an upright piano against one wall, old but well-maintained. "For practice," Eduardo explained. "I'll come by tomorrow to start your lessons. For tonight, rest. The real work begins soon enough." After Eduardo left, Pedro and his mother explored their new temporary home, opening cupboards to find them stocked with food, examining the strange European appliances, testing the soft beds with wonder. "It doesn't seem real," Pedro's mother said, sitting beside him on the couch. "A month ago, you were playing for coins in the plaza." Pedro nodded, unable to find words for the mixture of excitement, fear, and homesickness churning inside him. "I miss everyone already." "They miss you too." She squeezed his hand. "Your father made me promise to call as soon as we arrived. Should we try now?" The phone call home was both comforting and painful. His grandmother cried when she heard his voice. His brothers fought over who got to speak next. His father's voice, weaker than when they'd left, still carried his pride across the thousands of miles. "Are you practicing?" he asked, just as he did every night at home. "Not yet," Pedro admitted. "But there's a piano here. I'll practice tomorrow." "Good. Never stop playing." After the call, Pedro couldn't resist the piano any longer. Though exhausted, he sat and began to play softly, testing the instrument's response, finding it perfectly tuned and responsive. His mother watched from the doorway. "You should sleep," she said eventually. "You have a big day tomorrow." But Pedro wasn't ready for this day to end. Playing helped him process everything that had happened, everything that was still happening. In the familiar movement of his fingers across the keys, he found a thread of continuity between his old life and this new one taking shape around him. His mother eventually went to bed, but Pedro played on softly so as not to disturb her. He played his grandmother's songs, trying to hear them with new ears. Not just as melodies he'd grown up with, but as important compositions by a renowned musician. He played the popular songs from the plaza, remembering the faces of regular listeners who had dropped coins in his hat. And finally, he played a simple tune his father had whistled while getting ready for work each morning. As the unfamiliar sounds of Vienna at night filtered through the windows, distant sirens, unlike those in São Paulo, voices speaking in German, the rumble of streetcars, Pedro felt the first cautious tendrils of hope taking root. Maybe this strange city could become a sort of home after all, not replacing the one he'd left behind, but existing alongside it, a new branch growing from the same tree. He finally went to bed when his eyes grew too heavy to keep open. Tomorrow would bring his first real piano lesson, his first step toward becoming the musician Eduardo believed he could be. His first day of a life he still couldn't quite imagine. As he drifted off to sleep, Pedro could almost hear his grandmother's voice. Music isn't in the instrument but in the heart of the player. He carried that heart with him, across oceans and continents into whatever waited ahead. 5 years passed like the turning pages of a book, sometimes slowly, with difficult passages that Pedro had to read repeatedly to understand, and sometimes in a rush of excitement that left him breathless. The first year had been the hardest. After his mother returned to Brazil, Pedro moved into the student dormitory. The other students, many from wealthy European families, spoke English and German fluently. Pedro struggled with both languages, often retreating to the practice rooms where music became his primary means of communication. "Your technique needs complete rebuilding," Eduardo had told him during their first formal lesson. "But never lose the feeling in your playing. That's something I can't teach you." Pedro practiced 8 hours a day, his fingers cramping, his back aching, pushing through frustration and homesickness. He called home weekly, carefully avoiding mentioning his struggles. His father's health had stabilized with the money Pedro's scholarship provided for better medical care, but they couldn't afford international calls for small complaints. By the end of that first year, Pedro spoke functional German and played with technical precision that matched his classmates. Director Hoffman had even nodded approvingly during his end-of-term recital, high praise from someone who rarely offered compliments. The second year brought a breakthrough. The conservatory hosted a special concert featuring Antonio Barreto's newly discovered works, the pieces Pedro's grandmother had preserved through memory alone. Eduardo had spent months transcribing them properly, working from the recordings they had made in the São Paulo hotel room. Pedro's grandmother flew to Vienna for the concert, her first time on an airplane at age 73. The conservatory covered her expenses as a cultural consultant. When she heard an orchestra perform the full arrangement of her farewell melody, she wept openly. Antonio would be so proud, she told Pedro afterward, not just of his music being played, but of you, carrying it forward. In his third year, Pedro began composing his own music, blending Barreto's complex harmonies with the rhythms of his childhood in São Paulo. His professors encouraged this direction, recognizing something unique in his cultural fusion. "You're not just preserving Barreto's legacy," Eduardo told him. "You're extending it." By his fourth year, Pedro had grown from the skinny boy playing for coins into a young man whose recitals filled the conservatory's main hall. Music critics began to take notice. A record company approached him about recording both Barreto's rediscovered works and Pedro's own compositions. Now, in his 5th year at the conservatory, Pedro sat in his dormitory room reading a letter from home. His father's health had improved enough that he could work part-time again. His brothers were both in school, the younger one showing musical talent of his own. The neighborhood had collected money to properly repair their old piano, which now served as a teaching instrument for his grandmother's new students, children from the building who came for free lessons each afternoon. The letter ended with news that made Pedro's heart race. His entire family had been granted visas to attend his graduation concert. After 5 years of phone calls and occasional video chats at internet cafes, he would finally see them all again. Pedro tucked the letter into his composition notebook and headed to the conservatory for his final rehearsal. The main concert hall was already being prepared, workers arranging chairs, technicians checking microphones. "There you are," Eduardo called from the stage. "Ready for tomorrow?" Pedro nodded, though his stomach fluttered with nerves. This wasn't just any performance. Tomorrow's concert would feature the debut of his first symphony, a piece he had titled simply Grandmother's Song. It wove together Barreto's themes with his own original composition, telling the story of music passed down through generations, preserved against the odds. "My family arrives tonight," Pedro said, sitting at the grand piano center stage. "I won't see them until after the performance." Eduardo smiled. "They'll be in the front row. I've arranged everything." As Pedro played through the symphony's main themes, making final adjustments with the orchestra conductor, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the broken piano in their tiny apartment to this magnificent hall, from playing for spare change to performing for music critics and recording executives, it seemed impossible. Yet here he was. The rehearsal lasted until evening. Afterward, Eduardo walked with Pedro back to the dormitory. "I have news," the professor said. "The Vienna Philharmonic has accepted our proposal. They want to perform your symphony next season, with you as the featured soloist." Pedro stopped walking. The Philharmonic? Really? Eduardo nodded. Really, and there's more. The Music Academy in Sao Paulo has created a scholarship program inspired by your story. They've asked if you would consider teaching a masterclass there next summer. Teaching? Me? Pedro laughed. I'm still a student myself. Not after tomorrow, Eduardo reminded him. After tomorrow, you're a graduate of the Vienna Conservatory, a composer and pianist ready to begin his professional career. The reality of it hit Pedro with sudden force. 5 years ago, he couldn't have imagined this future. Now he couldn't imagine any other path. That night, Pedro couldn't sleep. He thought about his family arriving in Vienna, experiencing this world that had become his second home. He wondered if they would recognize him, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, the person he had become. Would they be proud? Would they understand that everything he had accomplished was because of them, because of his grandmother's songs, his mother's determination, his father's sacrifice? Morning came with sunshine streaming through his window. Pedro dressed carefully in the new suit Eduardo had insisted on buying him for the occasion, his first tailored clothing. As he knotted his tie, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back was older, more confident, but the eyes were the same, still carrying the memories of the plaza, the coins in his father's hat, the cramped apartment filled with music. At the conservatory, a buzz of excitement filled the backstage area. The orchestra warmed up, the hall filled with audience members. Pedro peeked through the curtain and spotted his family being escorted to their seats. His mother in a new dress, his father walking slowly but without assistance, his grandmother looking smaller than he remembered but beaming with pride, his brothers gazing around in wonder at the ornate ceiling and crystal chandeliers. Director Hoffman approached, straightening Pedro's tie with an uncharacteristic show of affection. "Your family has arrived safely," she said. "They seem very proud." "They should be," Eduardo added, joining them. "This is their accomplishment as much as it is yours." The house lights dimmed. Director Hoffman squeezed Pedro's shoulder before walking on stage to introduce the program. The audience applauded as Eduardo followed, taking his place at the conductor's podium. And then it was Pedro's turn. He walked onto the stage, the spotlight finding him as he moved to the grand piano. The audience applauded, but all he could see was the front row, his family rising to their feet, his father wiping tears, his grandmother nodding as if to say, "I always knew." Pedro sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. The orchestra waited for his cue. In that moment of silence before the first note, he thought of the public piano in the plaza where Eduardo had first heard him play, of the broken instrument at home with its missing keys and faulty strings, of his grandmother humming melodies as she taught him to play. He began with a single note, the opening of his grandmother's song, the melody that had changed everything. The orchestra joined and the music swelled, telling the story without words, struggle and hope, loss and discovery, separation and reunion. As he played, Pedro felt past and present merging. He was simultaneously the boy collecting coins in the plaza and the young man performing his first symphony. He was his grandmother preserving her teacher's music through decades of hardship, and he was the composer bringing those notes to life for a new generation. The final movement built to a crescendo, all the themes coming together in a celebration of perseverance and the power of music to transcend circumstances. When the last note faded, there was a moment of complete silence before the audience erupted in applause. Pedro stood, bowing to the orchestra, to Eduardo, to Director Hoffman. But his eyes sought only the front row, where his family stood applauding, their faces shining with tears and pride. Later, after the reception and the congratulations from critics and fellow musicians, Pedro finally had a moment alone with his family in a small room backstage. His father embraced him first. "I told you never to stop playing," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. His mother touched his face as if making sure he was real. "You look so grown up," she whispered. His brothers peppered him with questions about Vienna, about the orchestra, about what would happen next. But it was his grandmother who simply took his hands in hers, examining the fingers that had once struggled with a broken keyboard. "The music found its way," she said softly, "just as it was meant to." Pedro nodded, understanding completely. A melody recognized by a passing stranger had opened doors he never knew existed, but it was the music already inside him, passed down through generations, preserved through hardship, nurtured by love, that had carried him through. The destitute boy from the plaza had found his voice, and the world was listening,